Hello, thank you for watching another video by me. Today we will be talking about post-Napoleonic leaders in Russia to the present day. So we get to learn about Peter the Great, right? No, I said post-Napoleonic Russia. If you want to learn about that, go look at the Great Northern War. I need to make a video on that. After Napoleon's infamous defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Tsar Alexander I of Russia stopped using Enlightenment-based policies in order to convert to a more conservative agenda. Fact is, all the countries who had representatives at the Congress of Vienna were terrified that a power like Napoleon would rise again. I mean, who wouldn't be? The guy almost conquered Europe. That being said, while countries like Britain prospered in the Industrial Revolution, most Russian citizens were still serfs. Yeah, from the medieval ages, that kind of serf. Next in line was Tsar Nicholas I, who was pretty much a conservative like Alexander I, so really not much significance there. However, Tsar Alexander II was much more liberal. You have to give it to him. He did, for some time, eliminate serfdom. Nevertheless, those serfs would get caught up in debt and pretty much be in a worse situation than they were before. Whereas in the past, at least they had things provided for them. Now they were in debt and were tied down to the land on which they worked. Thus, Tsar Alexander II's attempt to repeal serfdom was largely a failure. Still, he did institute a system of zemstvos, which did allow a moderate degree of self-government. But it would not have mattered, and here is why. He was assassinated. The group responsible for his death was a group of Russian radicals known as the People's Will, and they were unhappy with his failed attempts to repeal serfdom. I'd love to say the Tsar died a quick, painless death. He actually died very slowly and very painfully. His son, Alexander III, who was grieved at his father's death, repealed all of his reforms pretty much straight away. And so Russia was still in serfdom, while the rest of the world prospered. Meanwhile, by 1905, the Russian transportation system was in critical condition. Why? Because of this. The Russo-Japanese War, which shocked the entire world because it was the first time a European country had lost to an Asian country. Keep in mind, this is in 1905. That was unheard of. Anyway, that the transportation system was in such critical condition meant that there was a lack of food in Russia, which made many poor workers, women, and ethnic minorities especially unhappy. So, a mass of demonstrators resorted to presenting a petition peacefully to the Tsar by marching to the streets. Unfortunately, Tsar Nicholas II thought it was violent and ordered Russian troops to fire on the unarmed crowd. This event was known as Bloody Sunday, and it sparked the Russian Revolution of 1905. To appease the Russian people and end the revolution, Tsar Nicholas II passed something called the October Manifesto, which created a legislative assembly known as the Duma. Nevertheless, he had practically totally repealed the Duma by 1907, leaving the Russian people with almost no form of self-government. It seemed as if this is how it was going to be for a while, if not forever, until a major event changed the course of world history forever. That event was World War I. Socialist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, originally from Russia, was sent back into Russia from exile by the Germans, hoping to push the Russians, their enemy, out of the war. Another revolutionary leader, Leon Trotsky, reluctantly stepped down when Lenin arrived. Next came the Russian Revolution, which was ultimately successful in getting rid of the Tsarist government. But first, I need to explain how Tsar Nicholas II and his family were pushed down from power. So let's go back a little, way before the Russian Revolution, otherwise known as the Bolshevik Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II had a hemophilic son, who of course, whenever he got a cut, he would never stop bleeding, you know. And his name was Alexis. The only person who could ever get him to stop bleeding was a man named Rasputin, so therefore, the Tsarist family assumed he was magic. However, he probably wasn't magic. He just told the doctors to stop giving Alexis painkillers, which would thin your blood. Yeah, duh. Due to this fact that Rasputin was able to seemingly magically cure Alexis, he heavily was able to influence the Tsarist regime because, they loved him so much. However, rumors spread that he was incredibly close with the female relatives of Tsar Nicholas II. I don't know if those rumors are true or not. I will say though, in the past with other women, that had been true. So again, maybe those rumors were true, maybe they weren't. What I do know though is that a lot of people did not like this influence that Rasputin had on the regime, so there were many attempts to assassinate him. I'm not going to go through them in any sort of order, but I will tell you that he had been stabbed, poisoned, shot multiple times, beaten, and was finally killed in an event that I do not want to describe because I like to keep this a clean channel. Let's just say that some not nice things happened. Meanwhile, the Russian people were very unhappy with an increase in bread prices, which was because of bread rationing in Petrograd for the war effort. So they participated in what became known as the March Revolution. Here's a photograph of it. Due to this, Tsar Nicholas II, who thought that the protest was violent, again, ordered Russian troops to fire on the crowd. Again. However, these troops abandoned their post and joined the protesters. Whoops. Russian representatives met at what was supposed to be a dissolved Legislative Duma, but they still met, so that was that. And basically what happened is they said, sorry, Tsar Nicholas II, we don't want you anymore. And they forced him out of power and detained him and later executed him and his family. This is a remnant of the scene of the execution after it was cleaned up. Interesting fact, this is actually where the story of Anastasia comes from. None of the claims of people who claim to be her were true, but it is still pretty interesting. And a good Disney movie. So, Vladimir Lenin was installed as leader of Russia and made Russia communist in 1917. Then he issued Army Order No. 1, which allowed soldiers in the Russian military to elect new officers. However, that led to a breakdown in the disciplinary system, and the Russian army crumbled. Soon, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk pulled Russia out of the Great War. After Vladimir Lenin's death in 1924, Leon Trotsky took charge of leading Russia. The country was renamed from simply Russia to a much more complicated name, which was the United Socialist Soviet Republic. Just so you know, Soviets were not just what you called people from communist Russia. The reason why it was called the USSR is because Soviets were independent people's governing bodies, very small ones, that were primarily socialist, thus the USSR. Now, at this point, the main governing body, the Politburo, as it was called, was divided between two main leaders, Leon Trotsky and another person named Joseph Stalin. Though, believe it or not, this is actually what Stalin looked like when he was young. This is how he's seen. Just goes to show you what totalitarianism will do to you. Now, this next part is going to happen really fast because we're cramming a lot of information into a really small space. I'll try to do some more videos to get this in more detail, but since we're just sticking to Russian leaders, just bear with me for the next few seconds. Leon Trotsky actually ended up being executed in Mexico a few years after he was forced out of the Politburo by Joseph Stalin, probably on Stalin's orders. Meanwhile, Stalin was doing things such as allowing the 5-year plan, which industrialized Russia, as you can tell, in 5 years, which would really help them during World War II. But, as we know, Stalin was an evil leader. Sorry. If you spoke out against communism under Stalin, you would be forced into a Siberian prison camp / labor camp and never heard from again. This guy was pure evil. Which reminds me, we have someone new to add to our Major Jerks of History board. I'm gonna use red pins on Stalin. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. Toward the end of World War II, it was pretty much ensured that Russia and the United States would emerge as two superpowers engaged in a Cold War. Where this aha moment occurred, it's hard to say, but I would say at the Yalta Conference. If you want to find out more about that, I may have a video on that, but I cannot make any promises. Ignoring the Korean War, Stalin's death in 1953 left the next in line, Nikita Khrushchev, with no real major problems. Oh, except for that ginormous Cold War that has the world in a state of fear. Now, Khrushchev was much, much better than Stalin, at least when you compare them. Other than that, he was sort of I mean, he did stop promoting Russian heavy industry and focus more on agricultural values. He closed down the Siberian prison camps in his policy of de-Stalinization, which was getting rid of Stalin-like institutions. He was also known to have a more or less comical personality, but placing Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1964 started the Cuban Missile Crisis, and all of that combined led to his forced removal by the Politburo in that same year. Now, quick thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis right now, just before I move on. If you're an American fan, before you start waving that American flag, yeah, we beat the big bad Soviet Union in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were just as much to blame. We had missiles in Turkey pointed at them the same time they had missiles in Cuba pointed at us. In fact, our missiles were there first. So actually, if anything, I'd say that was a pretty sorry thing that had to happen for both sides. Following Khrushchev was Leonid Brezhnev. Now, Brezhnev was definitely more dedicated to communism than Khrushchev was. especially in his passing of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which allowed the USSR to intervene in states where socialism was threatened with military force. This would lead to the Prague Spring, something I'm not going to go into detail about right now. I doubt I'll have a video on it, but you might want to look into that. I actually found it really interesting. Now, keep in mind, the United States did pretty much the same thing, but against socialism. They did that with the Truman Doctrine, which provided economic assistance to countries which claimed that they were threatened by socialism. That was installed after Britain pulled out of the Greek Civil War, by the way. After Brezhnev came Mikhail Gorbachev, who was definitely a more progressive leader. Gorbachev, contrary to pretty much all previous Soviet leaders, did allow much more freedom within the Soviet Union. For example, his policies of perestroika and glasnost allowed Russian citizens greater participation in Western culture, and it allowed them to talk about the weaknesses in addition to the strengths of the USSR, something which was strictly prohibited before. He was also the first president of the USSR. However, due to these reform efforts, that would spark the revolutions of 1989, which were by countries who were Soviet satellite states that no longer wanted to be communist. Probably the most bloody of which would have to be after Josip Broz Tito's death in Yugoslavia, the breakdown of Yugoslavia. Very, very bad. I'm not going to go into it again because I do like to keep this a clean channel. This subject I've been on actually said a lot of things I've skipped over. So if you are that person who has the stomach for it and do want to find out more, feel free to look into it, but I'm not going to go into those things on here right now. 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991, Gorbachev resigned, marking it as more of an official end to the Soviet Union, which had already occurred 2 years earlier, again, as I mentioned, when the Berlin Wall came down. Following this resignation, Boris Yeltsin led now Russia, no longer the USSR, and tried to convert it into a free market economy. In 1999, Vladimir Putin was elected Russia's next president. He is still president today, in 2019, and so far during his presidency, has sought to strengthen the role of the Russian central government. Well, that was the history of Russia's leaders since the Napoleonic era. My next video should be on the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars. And please do remember, if you want to see me do a video about any specific part of history, please do leave a suggestion in the comments. Have a nice day.